We've come out of the shadows of twilight. We've sailed across a vast sea of wonders. We looked up and soared through the sky, and we watched heroes from another time. Breath of the Wild was a daring game, one that brought us so many new adventures, and one that challenged the formula of Zelda games, and it ultimately succeeded where previous attempts have failed. It brought the whole Zelda community together and introduced numerous players into the franchise, especially those who didn't play Zelda games at all. For those who all chose to buy the Switch at launch, this was their very first game on the Switch. Those who stuck to the dying Wii U finally got to give the console a second chance. Breath of the Wild takes the best of everything and greatly improves on them. The Sheikah Towers function very much like the viewpoints from Assassin's Creed, mapping out the region around the player when visited. The inventory system is very much like the Elder Scrolls series, allowing the player to use a variety of different weapons and eat food to restore health or provide beneficial effects for gameplay. Like some Spider-Man games, almost everywhere in Breath of the Wild can be scaled and explored with the ability to climb on virtually any surface. The combat itself remains simple, skill-based, and very faithful to the previous 3D Zelda games. With the combat, there's a really satisfying point to how simple the combat is. You swing the sword 4 times with a sword, with the 4th hit being the strongest. You can move around at any speed you want, and you can jump at any time you want. The important thing is that the combat in this game actually feels like combat. You aren't mindlessly swinging your weapon like in the Elder Scrolls games, and you aren't attacking with very choreographed attacks like in Assassin's Creed. You're just attacking, and you feel every hit. Breath of the Wild's combat system is exactly the thing I want to see in other action-adventure games. Once again, the physics in combat are simple. Not limited, but simple. By simple, I mean that they are simple enough to learn and get used to, but also simple enough that there are infinite possibilities to what this game offers. I'm talking about the numerous glitches and exploits that Breath of the Wild offers. The amount of freedom that Breath of the Wild's physics gives off is crazier than anything I've ever seen. It's not like Spider-Man games in the sense that you discover more moves as you play through the game. It's something you simply have to play around with, thinking outside the box. Maybe you want to launch an enemy up to the sky or cause them to clip through the floor. Make a flying machine with 2 minecarts and go up to the highest point in the sky. Launch yourself hundreds of miles away at a speed you normally couldn't go. Maybe defeat the final boss in less than a second. There are so many glitches and exploits to cover in Breath of the Wild, but all of them aren't game-breaking in a way that's insulting towards Nintendo, but rather game-breaking in a way that gives so much replayability to Breath of the Wild. If you want something crazy, I'll show you right now. This is gameplay I captured of me successfully completing first-person glitch. Just imagine exploring Hyrule from your own point of view. Special thanks to AXK000 for discovering this glitch. 900p on the Switch, 720p on the Wii U, 30 frames per second. Fine by everyone, fine by me. But back at launch, the game had a painfully slow loading time, and there were choppy frame rates here and there. After all the updates, the game was functioning at the best it could be, and I'm happy that Nintendo put so much into this game to make it function properly. The comparisons between version 1.0 to now is night and day. Other than draining the battery from your Switch, Breath of the Wild is very playable. There's no point where you would complain about lag unless you intentionally caused it. Even playing this game on the Wii U gamepad screen works fine. Of course, there are also a bunch of mods out there that improve the frame rate and the resolution of this game. I don't think it's necessary at all considering this game already looks really nice. How about the controls? It couldn't become any more fun than this. They are very different from previous Zelda games, but for good reason. This is one of the very first games in a modern day where Nintendo has used every single feature on their controllers. To me, that feels like an accomplishment, seeing as how Nintendo never brought up a quote-unquote regular controller until the Wii U. Even throughout the Wii U's lifespan, I couldn't find a single Nintendo game that used every feature on the controller. You'd expect maybe at least one other game, but no. It wasn't until the console's last game on that console that they finally used everything. The controls themselves are very easy to learn and become muscle memory within minutes of playing the game. Not to mention the game teaches you as you keep playing through it. That also applies to the modals of this game. As done in previous Zelda games, motion controls were incorporated for the aiming in this game, and they worked pretty well. That's not to say they were perfect, the same way Splatoon mastered motion controls, but they certainly hold up against most other games on the Switch. My only nitpick is trying to use motion controls in handheld mode. There are certain cases where the game forces you to use motion controls, and while the puzzles themselves aren't actually that difficult, trying to solve them while playing in handheld mode can be a pretty tedious task. Ironically, both the Wii U and the Switch share the same problem. Nonetheless, the puzzles are easy enough to get around these issues, and most of these are stuck in the DLC anyways. As a bit of a bonus, I'll go ahead and talk about the VR mode in this game. Yes, you heard me right. Breath of the Wild in VR. Back in my review for 1-2 Switch, one of the most prominent comparisons I made was Nintendo Labo, a series of cardboard accessories that serve as a bit of a test for the Switch's hardware. The last accessory to be released along that line was a VR headset, and it still doesn't have a head strap. Anyways, the VR mode in Breath of the Wild is, well, probably the best and worst VR game on the Switch. That's not really saying much considering very few games actually use the headset, and I think Breath of the Wild is the only one where you can play the full game in VR mode. There's a catch though. The game is still in third person. Aside from just playing Breath of the Wild with more motion controls, there's really not much I can say about it. The game is still being capped off at 30 frames per second though, which means you're gonna get very sick. I wouldn't recommend playing through the entire game with this headset, but if you're up for the challenge, I think you're gonna have a very interesting experience. Plus, bragging right. It's time for me to talk about the story. I know. Breath of the Wild has a rather short story, and more of the game has been focused on gameplay rather than story. But one of the things that makes Breath of the Wild's story stand out from most other Zelda games is the events of the game can technically be played in any order, other than the beginning and end. This lets the player connect to Link more than in previous installments, especially since they can control his interactions with certain events within the story. There are even few examples leading to events that offer multiple paths, such as Sidon's introduction. Speaking of Sidon, I still haven't gotten to voice acting yet. This isn't the first time we've seen voice dialogue in a Zelda game, though I'm not going to name those games.
Yeah, that old Ganon's no match for the king!
But surprisingly, even as a main Zelda game, this isn't the first to receive voiced dialogue. Though that's something to talk about for another time. The point is, having voice dialogue signified a big change to the franchise the same way that the gameplay has. Having fully voiced lines in the game adds an entirely different perspective to how we see the story flesh out, and it gives the story a lot more life to it, allowing us to hear the actual expressions given out from the characters rather than focusing on their facial expressions. The story also avoids getting botched by the player's name by actually referring Link as Link first time. Unsurprisingly though, this game doesn't actually have a whole lot of voice dialogue outside of most cutscenes, and it's more of a treat to hear a small number of characters speak. It wasn't until Age of Calamity when we got a more defined experience with a lot more voice acting. Even so, I would say that Breath of the Wild was a strong start for the future of voice dialogue in the Zelda franchise. The English dub has the same mistakes as many dubs, but the voices behind the dubs have done their best to provide us with a story that carries a lot of potential, even if the lip syncing wasn't perfect. One of the best things shown off for Breath of the Wild was also one of the first things they showed off: the aesthetics. Breath of the Wild sticks true to its name. It's truly a Breath of the Wild, not just for the Zelda franchise, but for video games as a whole. This game had an emphasis on exploration, which in turn gave an emphasis on the environments. And with the emphasis on environments, it pretty much makes this an ASMR game. Compared to many other open world games, there's quite a lot more life in the world of Breath of the Wild. I don't mean having people or monsters or enemies, which there are plenty in every open world. I'm talking about nature. The idea of seeing wild animals roaming about, monsters roaming in pockets to the land, and various environmental and weather effects that make the world feel immersive. It takes what the early Assassin's Creed games did right, and it greatly improved upon them, topped off with the signature cel-shaded graphics that I like to call the definitive Zelda art style. That's another thing I like to mention. Back in my review for The Wind Waker, I talked about how that and Breath of the Wild share the same color palette. Considering how very few AAA games seem to take that approach, Breath of the Wild has definitely excelled in bringing us a unique aesthetic that draws in a lot of comparisons. If you see big, open, colorful green fields with calming atmospheric music and wind blowing on a bright, sunny day, you automatically think Breath of the Wild. If you see an incredible hybrid between cartoon and realism, you automatically think of Breath of the Wild. Even if the game wasn't like Breath of the Wild, you would call it a Breath of the Wild clone. That atmospheric music is what gives it away. It's also one of the common criticisms about Breath of the Wild. Ironically enough, Breath of the Wild has the largest soundtrack out of every Zelda game, despite only hearing a few piano tunes here and there as you travel around the world. Breath of the Wild's music makes an incredible effort to feel original, yet there is a portion of it that actually is just a variation of familiar themes, most famously being the Temple of Time theme. I think it goes to say that this is a perfect example of how to make a soundtrack feel original, yet be variations of old songs at the same time. The music itself matches the vibes of their respective environments. When traveling out in the wild, you can hear peaceful piano music go hand in hand with the sounds of nature and the wind blowing. Birds chirp throughout the day, and crickets can be heard throughout the night. If you venture into the cold, you hear music almost as if the music was legitimately played with ice. If you venture into heat, you feel like you're going to be sweating in dry desert heat. If you venture into a volcanic region, you'll hear a very familiar theme. Regardless of where you are, the music is meant to be played atmospherically. You aren't supposed to be hearing loud and adventurous music as you roam around Hyrule Field, because it eliminates the vibes that are set from the weather and nature. Besides, Nintendo Black Crisis was right about one thing. You never know what can happen until you hear a distinct, dangerous piano tune interrupt the calm vibes. As far as music goes for special occasions and settlements, it is a perfect blend between unique and nostalgic. While the Gerudo Town and Goron City themes are completely original themes, Zora's Domain and Rito Village both play variations of themes we've grown up with. Kakariko Village takes a Japanese folklore approach, and Lurelin Village shows off the beauty of Hyrule's coast with its tropical music. Tarrey Town's theme emphasizes on the gradual growth of the settlement, with more instruments being added in as you progress through the major side quest. Finally, Hateno Village. This theme feels strangely like a place you want to call home. You come home to the village at the end of Hyrule, unravaged by the effects of the Great Calamity, to hear this peaceful and humble theme of what Hyrule life would be like in the countryside, with no such burdens in life, or the feeling that you're in such a strange place. You are home. You are in a place where everyone lives happily, where even the strangest of people manage to settle in, and where you ultimately can choose to live in if you decide to do so. The atmosphere set by this theme is very reminiscent of previous Zelda games, Kokiri Forest, Outset Island, and Ordon Village. They are all radically different in styles of music, yet all of them make you feel like you returned from a long adventure. You finally made it back home. Then comes the combat theme. I've already implied how intense the Guardian theme was, so let's skip right to the main battle theme. There's not much to say about it. other than the music being an indication of what kind of battle you're in. Certain enemies cue a different part of the battle theme, and they all eventually lead to the same parts of the song. Sometimes the music ends and it cues a special reward. The other enemies, most notably the overworld mini-bosses, have those respective themes. The ones that you hear and remember. They were definitely written to match their respective vibes, and I would talk more about them, but that's honestly something I think you should experience for yourself. Much of the iconic themes were reserved for cutscenes, which I found was a brilliant idea if you take into what was discussed earlier. Almost every major character in the game got their own distinctive theme, and you would almost immediately tell who it is because of how drastically different their themes were. Overall, the music in Breath of the Wild was written in the way it was on purpose, and I could go more in depth about each of these songs, but I feel like the best way to describe them is by experiencing it for yourself. I felt the need to address the DLC separately as I've done in previous reviews. For Breath of the Wild, there were two major DLCs released during this game's lifecycle, and the first was known as the Master Trials. As the name implies, the DLC introduces a series of trials and other content that are often more challenging than what was offered in the base game, if the base game wasn't already difficult enough. DLC 1 introduced, or perhaps I should say, reintroduced, Master Mode and the Trial of the Sword. Master Mode is just a rebranded version of Second Quest, Master Quest, or Hero Mode from previous Zelda games, acting as the higher difficulty level for the game. Obviously, being locked behind a paywall is a bit of a punch to the gut, and initially I really had a grudge against it, but as time went on, considering how most older Zelda games didn't get a harder difficulty until they re-released or remastered them, I don't think the DLC price tag is all that bad anymore. Sure, it would have been nice to have Master Mode at launch, but I suppose it's better than buying a whole entire version of the game again. Besides, Master Mode is slightly different than what we've previously seen. Rather than sustaining double the damage, you're pitted against enemies one level higher than normal, which automatically means you're going to take a lot more damage, but you're also going to get better weapons earlier. In other words, higher risk, higher rewards. You're going to be killed by certain enemies in one hit a lot more often. Another thing to note is that the enemies heal over time if they're not damaged, which really changes up the strategies involved in this game. You're most definitely going to either use exploits or be a pacifist for a large portion of the early game, whereas in later segments, you have to play very aggressively and apply lots of pressures towards enemies, or they can. I guess you can say this game truly tested your courage. The Trial of the Sword is basically a new version of the Gauntlet-style dungeons from previous games. Stuff like the Savage Labyrinth or the Cape of Ordeals, where you can go through several rooms and fight basically every enemy in the game in one consecutive run without the ability to save in between, is the same with the Trial of the Sword. The rewards for each segment is an upgraded Master Sword, with the final reward being a permanent Master Sword upgrade, and a bit of extra story added as a bonus. Once again, it's something that didn't necessarily need to be stuck behind a paywall, but considering how uniquely different this dungeon was, making use of the actual environments and effectively straining your reason, I think I'll let this one pass. The end reward isn't necessarily that overpowered considering there are just so many better weapons out there, and the Master Sword can still break with enough hits. It's basically just a permanent version of the Master Sword upgrade you get temporarily in the game already. Other features in DLC 1 include a few cosmetics that are great for early game playthroughs and eventually get phased out. Other features include something on a map that lets you track your gameplay history, and the ability to set a teleportation marker to teleport wherever you want. Once again, nothing too game-breaking considering the game already has a lot to offer, and these are just minor quality of life improvements, if you even consider looking at your game history as a quality of life improvement. The second DLC to this game, known as the Champion's Ballad, gave the player a bit more to do after they've completed the 4 main dungeons. Aside from a few cosmetics, much of this DLC's content is intertwined. It gave a whole extra dungeon and 16 more shrines to complete, with a cutscene given after completing each major segment of the game. The first segment of this DLC introduced one of the most daring and heart-pounding trials. It doesn't matter if this was Master Mode, you are temporarily given a special weapon that instantly kills any enemy in one hit. In return, you also die in one hit. Keep in mind, this isn't any regular minigame. This is part of the main DLC quest, and it's not just you going on a killing spree around the starting area of the game. You also have to complete 4 shrines, all of which were designed to be a big nuisance, several traps and enemies that can kill you in one hit. This is one of my favorite parts of the game, and although it can only be played through once, this idea was carried over to Age of Calamity and has been done pretty decently. But what about the cutscenes themselves? What about that extra story introduced in this DLC? Many people criticize this DLC for being too short by offering just 5 extra cutscenes and too much reading involved. But I found it to be a healthy balance when played alongside the main playthrough of the game. In a sense, it's quality over quantity. What it did was leave us desiring for more from these various characters, but it also gave enough for us to connect to them in a way. It definitely fit in very well with the main story and gave an entirely different perspective to what we already knew about the history. Had it not been for this DLC's 5 cutscenes, I likely wouldn't be as connected to these characters as I am now. That being said, it set the bar high enough to be easy to surpass, which they eventually did with Age of Calamity, and I'm definitely hoping that Breath of the Wild 2 does the same. Breath of the Wild is probably the best open-world game I have ever played, and I believe that this game has mastered the genre. With the fluent controls and freedom of gameplay, the easy-to-navigate world, and the wide variety of environments, a story of discovery after a time of tragedy, and a community that continues to actively support it to this day, Breath of the Wild has evolved to become something more than just a Zelda game. It has become its own identity and has even changed the base concept of what a Zelda game should be, and how we identify our iconic hero, Link, who no longer wears the green tunic by default. It left a legacy of media that followed after it, inspiring games like Genshin Impact and Immortals Phoenix Rising. It introduced several players to the Zelda franchise where previous games could not, and it opened up numerous possibilities for fan-created content. Speedruns, fan mods, glitch discoveries, theories, challenges, and many other possibilities were given to this game. We were given Age of Calamity, a game that propelled the Warriors series to the sky. Breath of the Wild's magic is everywhere throughout the game, and we were able to see what wasn't in Breath. We will soon be getting a sequel to Breath of the Wild, a game so highly anticipated that we were talking about it before it was even announced. By the time Breath of the Wild 2 gets released, we would have been able to explore this specific version of Hyrule 3 times, which already sets a record among all Zelda games. Having the opportunity to speak to Sean Chiplock, the voice actor of Revali, was a great honor to have, and it certainly amplified my views on Breath of the Wild. Winning the Game of the Year award in 2017 and rising above most open world game, taking the crown for the Play It By Tier game ranks, my final ranking for The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is